The Lion Farm estate is at Oldbury, in the metropolitan borough of Sandwell and Dudley. This is the eastern fringe of the Black Country, where it seamlessly allies with Birmingham. It's a place of former mines, former forges, ruinous factories, little-used canals and big sheds. The estate was built in the first half of the 1960s, when the area was pre-post-industrial. It comprised 3 13-storey towers, 6 16-storey towers, several terraces of maisonettes, some streets of 2-storey semi-detached houses and some of shops, some iffy public sculpture, much lawn, a kind of drop-in centre, a pub, Mitchell and Butler's, a school and a church to which would be attached a signboard announcing, hopefully, that Jesus is alive. When construction began, Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister. When it was completed, Harold Wilson's first administration had just put an end to what the People's Party's propagandists called 13 years of Tory misrule. Peter Griffiths, who stood successfully in the Tory interest in adjacent Smethwick in that 1964 election, campaigned with the infamous slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Liberal or Labour." He found himself branded a parliamentary leper by Wilson. Such deserved antagonism was actually rare. And in one area there was, and there would remain till the advent of Margaret Thatcher 15 years later, a cross-party consensus so entrenched that it was a given: the need to build public housing. The epithet social housing was in the future. The need was not challenged or challengeable. To question it would have been as squalid and grotesque as Griffiths' winning formula. Beyond satisfying need, there existed the conviction that it was the duty of local and national government to provide a home for those who could not afford one. There were, it must be recalled, people living in caves only 20 miles from Oldbury, at Wolverley, Kinver and other sites in the Severn Valley until the turn of the 1960s. No running water, no gas, no electricity. They were exceptional. But my grandmother, the widow of a man born in Oldbury, was not. She was one of hundreds of thousands of people whose house at that date, a decade and a half after the end of the Second World War, had no bathroom, had no indoor toilet. Hers happened to be in Evesham, but it might have been anywhere in Britain. Modernisation was a necessity, not a luxury. Speed of construction was vital. The sheer number of homes that had to be built was daunting. Aesthetic ideology, political exigency, volume and urgency proved to be an often baneful combination. Schemes were not thought through. Infrastructure was overlooked. Unproven technologies were employed. Little consideration was granted to the suitability of novel forms to domestic life. Nonetheless, new communities did flourish, house-proud communities. The present was materially better than the recent past. When Robert Clayton made his photographs of Lion Farm Estate, even its most recent buildings were more than a quarter of a century old. That was in 1991. The consensus on housing was long since ruptured. The right to buy had been introduced, and with it a fiasco of unintended consequences, one of which was the establishment of a hierarchy of social housing, a de facto two-tier system which defined what was desirable and would be bought, and what was, no matter how cheap, unsaleable. The latter tended to be flats, that multiply occupied buildings might require constant maintenance was a notion that was no longer entertained, and had, in some instances, never been entertained. And perhaps the elected representatives and housing department personnel all drove cars that did not have to be serviced. The neglect of public housing stock increased. Yet, despite that neglect, there was no marked diminution in the quality of life. What changed the complexion of social housing for all time was the practice of decanting into second-tier projects sociopaths, recidivists, junkies, the unemployable, the willfully dependent, and the ranting, mumbling, cast-out victims of another cruel wheeze of that era, the mendaciously named care in the community. Clayton captured Lion Farm on the eve of this calamitous invasion, which would result in the partial destruction of the estate. The strength of his vision and his work's usefulness and poignancy are found in its balance. It shows a place that is worn, far from perfect, rough at the edges, where civility is perhaps provisional, where the promise of worse to come has not yet been fulfilled. Clayton resists drama and melodrama. He eschews exaggeration. In his landscape compositions, he does not make the towers appear heroic. His method is antithetical to that of institutionalized architectural photography, which flatters buildings and their makers, often by excising their surroundings so that they look like standalone objects. A trick, one that we fall for time and again, until we are reminded by a work like this that everything has a context, a place in the unruly jigsaw. In this case, a place that is difficult to define. The estate was built on former agricultural land, and whilst a cursory scrutiny suggests that it was intended to start from zero, it incorporates a few earlier houses that had spilled out of what? The fringes of something? The outskirts of somewhere? There is a palpable air of dislocation. It is centrifugal, or would be, had it a centre to flee from. There is no such thing as a non-place, but there are places whose incoherence and shapelessness render them bewilderingly illegible. Their identity is frail. Where do they belong? Lion Farm is further puzzling. The back country is among the most populous areas of Britain. Yet the estate seems both far from anywhere and, more astonishingly, deserted to the point of desolation. Sure, Clayton makes portraits of some of the inhabitants. These compositions are artfully artless. The camera is often only just above floor level. Sometimes the shot is gently skewed. A pair of shoes protrudes into frame. The subjects no more reveal themselves than they would in a passport photo. They're not sitters. They're seldom animated. Communication between people is perhaps the exception. The estate harbours a worrying number of dogs, mostly of breeds that are rarely quadruped weapons. The overwhelming impression is of want and emptiness. A void in the heart of England, a zone bereft of people. Raggedy grass stretching to the horizon, vast concrete car parks with no cars, a removal van in the distance, pylons, blank walls, minimal graffiti, deserted lift wells. Clayton's reluctance to push colours is indicative of the entire project. There is no moral virtue in avoiding saturation, and there is nothing dishonest about availing oneself of post-production tools. But there is, unquestionably, a documentary virtue in recording what things were like without caricature, without attitude, without exaggeration, without intercession, so far as that is possible. For naturalism is, after all, a form of artifice that occludes its artifice. Still, he convinces us that this is what it was like a generation ago. His Lion Farm was obviously not the green and pleasant that the post-war consensus strove for, and did sometimes achieve. But nor was it a dystopian slum. Only the faintest germ of its potential to become one is apparent. A vandalised car, boarded up windows. It could go either way. Tomorrow is, as ever, ungraspable. And anyway, the photographer is not a soothsayer. Indeed, he willfully avoids predictive signs. Within a few years, 6 of the tower blocks would be demolished in accordance with fashion's dictates. It was not the lives that were transitory, but the buildings. The average life of a building shortens just as we enjoy ever more longevity. Clayton was there just in time. What he recorded is valuable precisely because it shows neither a model estate, showplace, nor a sink. The typical is elusive. It's a hard thing to capture because it surrounds us and doesn't shout. It is the 90% that is habitually overlooked as we set our sights on the exceptional 10%. On the one hand, picture postcard tourism, on the other, frissons of delight at noxious slums. There was nothing special about Lion Farm Estate. It could have existed in more or less any British conurbation that was on the cusp of losing its raison d'être. What is special is Clayton's humane rendering of it as a time capsule that emphasised ordinariness. This was how it was for millions of people in the early 90s. And this was Britain between Thatcherism and, well, the smiley neo-Thatcherism of New Labour. A new political consensus was in place, an insidious consensus that blithely disregarded the sort of people who lived on such estates. The little people who had not the wherewithal to exercise their precious right to buy. Again, Clayton leaves us to reach such conclusions. He has a broad and important socio-political point to make, but it's all the more potent for being made so quietly.